day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to AJC at the Conventions 2020, AJC's virtual advocacy programming on the sidelines of the Democratic and Republican National Conventions. With the DNC now underway, we are delighted to be joined today by longtime friends of AJC, Representative Ted Deutsch, Chairman of the House Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and International Terrorism, Haley Soifer, Executive Director of the Jewish Democratic Council of America, and Robert Wexler, President of the S. Daniel Abraham Center for Middle East Peace and Member of Congress from 1997 to 2010. These three esteemed guests are here to discuss the future of the U.S. Israel relationship and the challenges and aspirations for this vital alliance. Moderating today's conversation will be Bel Yoeli, AJC Chief of Staff and Chief Innovation Officer. Please be advised that AJC is a nonpartisan 501c3 nonprofit organization, and as such, AJC will not endorse or oppose political parties or candidates. And as a reminder, AJC will be hosting identical panels on the sidelines of both the Democratic National Convention and Republican National Convention. After we hear from Bel and our esteemed guests, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Bel, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you again to our distinguished guests for joining us today. I have a lot I want to ask you. We also want to have time for Q&A, so I'm just going to jump right in. Let's start with recent news, and we'll go in order of the events. First, it's convention week. Haley, I have to ask you about Senator Harris, our VP, the DNC's VP nominee. You worked for her as National Security Advisor. Tell us about her position towards Israel. Should supporters of Israel be happy with this pick?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Thanks to the agency. And I'm thrilled to speak to Harris as our nominee, the Vice President, having worked with her for in the Senate, right when she arrived in the Senate in 2017. I can tell you firsthand that I have seen the strong ties between her and the Jewish community and her strong support of Israel. I had the honor of traveling with her to Israel in 2017, and she is without question a supporter of the U.S. Israel relationship, of U.S. military aid to Israel, and of the people-to-people ties that really form the foundation of this relationship. We traveled to Beersheba to look at the cyber relationship. We traveled to look at the relationship as it relates to water. And she met with both Prime Minister Netanyahu and leaders from the opposition in Israel. She is also a closely allied and even a part of the Jewish community in California. And as attacks against our community increased in 2017, she led a bipartisan effort, a resolution in the Senate that passed overwhelmingly with Senator Rubio to condemn the rise of anti-Semitism. She had me personally checking in with all the JCCs and Jewish community centers across California to make sure that everyone was okay as there were those increased bomb threats in 2017. And of course, she has Jewish family. She goes by Mamala, and she is without question not just a friend of our community, but in many ways a part of it.
Thank you so much, Haley. And I know we'll come back to the potential Biden administration and Senator Harris's role. Congressman Deutsch, moving on to another recent event, I want to ask you, as chairman of the House Subcommittee on the Middle East, can you give us your reaction to the recent UAE-Israel peace deal and potential news of more peace with Israel's neighbors down the line? How do Democrats in Congress view these developments, and what is the role that Congress can play in promoting further peace and normalization?
Sure. Well, Bel, thanks for the question. Thanks for having me, and my apologies for participating from the road as we take our son back to college. But this is I think it was historic news. Clearly, this is something that we should all welcome. The idea that we're now facing normalized relations between Israel and a Gulf country in the United Arab Emirates is evidence of the changing nature of the region. The realization that what Israel and so many other countries have in the region, what they have in common is so much greater now, whether it is the shared threat that Iran poses to them, or the desire to fully engage, to participate in a whole host of ways that will strengthen both countries, their security, their economic growth, the opportunities for the people who live there. So this is a really important milestone, and our hope is, and from conversations that I've had with others and conversations that we've been engaged in since this news broke, we're certainly hopeful that this is the first step, and that there will be more, and that we'll hear similar news like this coming from other countries. And since we're having this conversation around the Democratic Convention, I think it's also important to point out how important a day like this is to reflect on the importance of diplomacy. I know we'll talk a lot about Vice President Biden, and we'll talk a lot about what we have to look forward to in a Biden administration. But this move really highlights the importance of diplomacy in bringing about change. Certainly, we hope, as I mentioned, that it's not just going to be the relationship between Israel and her and the other countries in the region, but also we hope that this is a time, as this decision was made by Israel to not go forward with annexation, that this is also a time that the UAE and other countries can try to push the Palestinians to return to the negotiating table, and understand that we can respect the Palestinians' right to self-determination, and that this would be an ideal model, recognizing all that will be gained from achieving the normalization of relations between Israel and the UAE.
Thank you, Congressman. And Congressman Wexler, Congressman Deutsch mentioned this is something that we should all welcome, this development. And obviously, you remember Congress for a long time, seasoned member of the party. We were particularly struck at AJC, and I'm sure others were, by Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib's reaction to the UAE Israel peace deal development. And obviously, she's been one of the more controversial voices in Congress on this issue. Let me read what she said so our audience knows. She said, "We won't be fooled by another Trump-Netanyahu deal. We won't celebrate Netanyahu for not stealing land he already controls in exchange for a sweetheart business deal. The heart of the issue has never been planned formal annexation, but ongoing devastating apartheid." What is your reaction to this type of comment? Should we be concerned by this type of voice on this, what would seem to be a victory for U.S. allies? And do you view this as a trend or simply a matter of a few individuals?
It's highly unfortunate language, both in terms of the substance and also in terms of the symbolic or the illustrations that are made by that kind of language. And they're patently false in terms of any equation between what's happening in Israel and apartheid and so forth. I think what Congressman Deutsch said deserves repetition, and that is that the agreement between Israel and the UAE should be celebrated by all Americans, pro-Israel Americans, everyone who cares about peace in the Middle East and moving towards a more successful Middle East. What I think is missing, with all due respect to the Congresswoman's analysis, is that making progress in terms of Palestinians and making progress in terms of regional peace, it's not a either or. In fact, what this represents, meaning the arrangement between Israel and the UAE, is that a regional approach supports or should support a track with the Palestinians. And that's the difference, I would respectfully suggest, between what hopefully will be a Biden administration and the current administration. The challenge that President Biden will have with Vice President Harris is incorporating the progress on the regional track into progress on the Israeli-Palestinian track. But I would argue that the progress with the UAE and hopefully Bahrain and maybe Morocco and others will in fact encourage process. But the big difference is that from a Palestinian perspective, of course, the Trump administration has been slow or unequivocal to recognize American policy in terms of supporting a negotiated two-state solution. Under a Biden administration, that will change. And the attitude towards the American government towards the Palestinians will change. Undoubtedly, there will be moves to resurrect the consulate general position in Jerusalem to directly deal with the Palestinians. There will be a reestablishment of assistance programs consistent with American law, but there will be responsibilities that the Palestinians have as well. And the first responsibility that they have is to put themselves in effect in a line with American law, which will prevent Palestinian payments from going from perpetrator to perpetrators of terror.
Thank you very much, Congressman. Congressman Deutsch, I want to come back to you on one more regional development before moving on. Obviously, there are two key situations happening in Israel's neighborhood, the situation in Lebanon and also developments with Turkey and Greece. Israel could easily be drawn into either conflict. What's your thinking and the party's current thinking on how the United States should be approaching both of these issues?
Well, starting with Lebanon, certainly what we've seen, and we've since the massive explosion in Beirut, is a reminder of how much the people of Lebanon have suffered, and they deserve a government that puts their interests and the interests of their country first, not a government that recognizes or that focuses on Hezbollah. Hezbollah's got to be held accountable like the rest of the leaders in Lebanon. And that's, I think, what you see in the people marching in the streets there. People of Lebanon don't want to be beholden to a group that puts resistance ahead of things like the health care of the people and a government that is accountable to the people. And so it's not easy to prevent groups from taking advantage of chaos, but we've got to prioritize, again, focusing on diplomacy and the opportunity to work with our allies, the French in particular, to use the moment to prevent greater instability in Lebanon and to really focus on ensuring that even as we try to further isolate Hezbollah and the threat that they pose, that we're also recognizing there's an opportunity to create a government that's better for the Lebanese people and ultimately Israel's security as well. Just look, as far as Turkey and if you look at the maritime aggression of Turkey recently and the threat that that poses, we also have to recognize that they've continued to undermine U.S. interests in the Eastern Mediterranean and in Libya and the cooperation with Russia. And it's really important, again, that we come together with our allies. And as it relates to the Eastern Med in particular, Bell, something that I know AJC has been deeply involved in, something that I've worked on with so many leaders from AJC, and strengthening the cooperation between Israel and Cyprus and Greece. That's particularly important, and those efforts, I think, are especially important as Turkey continues to stir things up there. It's a role that the United States has to continue to play, and again, I cannot say this enough. As we're looking ahead to the election, one of the things that's really going to be on the ballot, I believe, as we go forward, is how diplomacy is going to be used and the extent to which America should, and I would argue must, continue to play a prominent role as a leader in addressing these very challenges that we've been discussing and that we care so much about.
Thank you, Congressman. So moving away from recent events, I want to take us to, I think, some of the core questions that are on the minds of American Jews, particularly as it relates to Israel in this conversation. I mentioned Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. Obviously, there is this continuing concern over more left-wing or extreme voices, I'm not sure there's a correct term to describe them, that are developing in the Democratic Party that are getting at least more attention when it comes to Israel. How concerned should supporters of Israel be about these voices? And how can we ensure that the U.S. Israel relationship does not fade in Congress or the party more broadly? And what can be done to educate these voices about Israel? And I'd welcome each of you to weigh in here. Haley, maybe we start with you.
Great. Well, today as we begin the Democratic Convention, the Democratic Party itself is going to be adopting a platform that unequivocally expresses support of Israel. This builds on the extremely strong platform that we had in 2016 and even goes beyond that to affirm support of the $38 billion memorandum of understanding that was negotiated by President Obama and Vice President Biden. It unequivocally opposes the BDS movement. It supports a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that is the position of the Democratic Party. And that's also what we've seen in Congress in terms of votes. There have been numerous opportunities for votes, and one need look no further than the record to see that the overwhelming majority of Democrats are very supportive of Israel. But I am concerned about extremism, and that has to do with the extremism that we've seen on the Republican side of the aisle when it comes to the security of the Jewish community, starting with the president on down. And there are 17 candidates running as Republicans, including some incumbents, who not only have amplified white nationalist voices, but are associated with extremist organizations like the QAnon movement, and they are all Republicans. And that is because they have an ally in the White House in President Trump. So yes, we're worried about extremism, and we're worried about extremism on the Republican side of the aisle. But when it comes to Israel, we're very proud of this platform, and it expresses the support of Israel that is the view of Joe Biden, our candidate, and the view of the overwhelming majority of our party.
Haley, I totally respect your answer, but I want to push back for a second, because obviously, as you heard before, we're going to have our own time at the RNC to take on some issues. There are issues within both parties, but let me push back on the specific, whether it's the squad or certain individual members that are speaking loudly. Obviously they're getting a lot of attention. So how do Jewish advocacy organizations like yours, other people who are concerned, are we simply to say to them, just ignore it? Or is there room for education? Perhaps, obviously another question that was raised, when you see Speaker Pelosi weighing in and endorsing some of the candidates that for the Jewish community are particularly controversial, there's going to be a reaction to that. So there has to be some, what would you say to people who are raising those questions?
Sure. Well, there are two members of the Democratic Party who have expressed a difference of views when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, support of aid to Israel, or the BDS movement. And our organization, JDCA, has spoken out against them even when they were candidates for Congress in 2018. No one's ignoring anything. But they are two members of the over 270 between the House and the Senate, less than 1% of our party. And what matters is the view of the overwhelming majority, people like Congressman Deutsch, who represent the views of our party, and people who played a role in creating this platform, which is unequivocal in its support of Israel. So those are the views of our party. And then if you look at the record, you will see that when it comes to aid, when it comes to a two-state solution, and when it comes to every aspect of the U.S. Israel relationship, there is overwhelming support for that view, which is the mainstream view of the Democratic Party, and that is support of Israel.
Thank you, Haley. Congressman Wexler, Congressman Deutsch, did you want to weigh in as well?
Sure. The wonderful thing about Israel is that the truth is nothing short of miraculous. The extraordinary accomplishments of Israel are something that we all can take great pride in. Is Israel a perfect nation? Of course not, just like our own nation is not perfect. And they strive and will continue to strive for peace. Having said that, most Democrats, including Congressman Deutsch, took very principled, courageous positions standing up for the rights of self-determination of Palestinians in opposition to annexation, because the Democratic Party is committed to a negotiated two-state solution and ultimately agreed land swaps, which will achieve for Israel much of what annexation will achieve, but done so in collaboration with Palestinians and the international community. So the voices that Haley and you ask about, of course, they need to be countered with facts. But the good news is the facts are on the side of pro-Israel democratic positions. What I think will happen, though, which is the good news, when there is a Biden-Harris administration and people see the progress that a an administration that is committed to engaging both Israelis and Palestinians from a position of respect and strength, then there will not be a need, as there is today, where people perceive a one-sided or a more one-sided American policy, to strike out in a hypercritical way towards Israel. Hypercritical, punitive language and prospective policies towards Israel must be defeated. There's no question about that. And they will be defeated. And as Haley said, the Democratic platform, it's not a coincidence that it's a pro-Israel straight across the line platform. It was literally written by Joe Biden himself. He made the decisions in terms of whether or not to include the type of language that illustrates decades of strong Democratic Party and bipartisan consensus favorable to Israel.
Thank you. Congressman Deutsch, unless you want to weigh in on that one, I can ask you another question. Up to you. Although I think we might have spotty service for a second. So I will, it's okay, I will come back. And honestly, this question I would love to hear from all of you as well. We mentioned the platform committee, and obviously it seems like there's a good amount of faith that the Biden-Harris administration will continue pro-Israel policies, with I think one major area of concern being the question of the Iran nuclear deal, which is of course of particular importance to supporters of Israel. What do you think, give us your analysis of what the Biden administration will look like for Israel. Obviously, Congressman Wexler touched on it. But also, if perhaps this is one of the more difficult questions, why should pro-Israel supporters, let's say who focus on Israel as a single issue, lean towards a President Biden, despite what some would describe as—
chime in on that?
Of course.
I would just like— Can you hear me? Let me start with that.
We can hear you.
Great. So you don't need to see me anyway. And let me say very quickly one point just to follow up on the last question, which is because it gets leads directly into this question. And that's this. There is this enormous amount of attention paid to a very, as Haley points out, a very tiny percentage of the Democrats in the House, and even in the freshman class. What I would suggest people can and should do, those of us who care deeply about the strength of this relationship, is look to the vast majority of not just the Democratic caucus, but the freshmen in particular. People, Alyssa Slotkin and Max Rose and Abigail Lai, the House overwhelmingly voted to reaffirm the ironclad support for Israel's security. So that then leads to the Iran deal, which is, as we look ahead to a Biden-Harris administration,
Unfortunately.
The question is,
So sorry, Congressman Deutsch, but you got cut off for a second. And as soon as you come back in, we're gonna let you continue, because I know you were on an important train of thought there. Okay, I'm assuming he's gonna come back in. But Congressman Wexler, Haley, perhaps you want to kind of pick up on this. I'm sure you have similar trains of thought.
I do. The most important thing, of course, in the Democratic Party, President Obama, Vice President Biden, and no doubt President Biden will be committed to preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. That is a non-starter. What I think has been learned is that not only must the administration's policy be designed to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power, but in conjunction with combating Iran's ambitions on the nuclear arena, we must also combat at the same time their non-nuclear nefarious behavior. And the Democratic platform, again, is very clear, where it said the original Iran nuclear deal was meant to be the beginning of diplomacy in terms of Iran.
interest of the United
Seems like Ted is coming back.
States.
All right, we're trying to fix the technical difficulties. Sorry about that. You can continue.
The essential point, I think, is compare where we were under the Obama-Biden administration, which was pushing the Iranians back from nuclear capability, and with a world consensus favorable to the American position. Look at where we are today, where even our closest European allies, the British, the Germans, the French, are not working with us in the UN Security Council in terms of the arms relative to Iran.
I'm sorry about that. We're unfortunately getting some strange feedback. I want everyone to hear what you're saying, so we're going to see if we can fix the issue really quickly.
I think the essential point is that effective American diplomacy should achieve two goals. Number one, prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power. And two, confront their non-nuclear nefarious behavior, whether it's in Syria or Lebanon or in the Gulf or in Libya. And that takes an across-the-board strategy that cannot be successful with just American influence alone. We need to, again, develop an international consensus that makes Iran the isolated party. And what happened at the UN over the last few days is disgraceful, where Iran is not prevented, where the arms embargo will arguably go out of existence. But the secondary story was that our own administration failed to develop that consensus. And what Americans ought to look at, like, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, in terms of the question of Iran, is do they really believe we will be most successful confronting Iran when we're doing it only with the Dominican Republic? That's the only country that voted with us at the UN. Or are we going to be more successful when there's a European consensus? And let us not forget, President Obama and Vice President Biden were successful in bringing the Russians and the Chinese along in terms of the American objectives. Unfortunately, President Biden is going to have to rebuild, in a very difficult circumstance, that type of consensus. He needs to do it in conjunction with Israel. He needs to do it in conjunction with the UAE and our Gulf states, respecting their very rightful concerns. But the way to do it is not to lose votes at the UN over an arms embargo.
Haley, I want to give you an opportunity to add to that, but let me also just ask a follow-up question. Obviously, you know very well, many people took issue with the Iran deal, not even as a partisan issue, just concerns about the deal. And some would argue that the deal failed in essence also because of flaws that were within the deal. And now we're facing a time where, and we're assuming that the Iranians will negotiate again, let's say with President Biden. And how would a Biden administration, address those aspects of the deal that were concerning, especially those that were of particular importance to Israel?
Where we are today versus where we were just a few years ago with President Obama at that because while yes, there were a range of views with regard to the deal, and even the Obama administration itself acknowledged it was not a perfect deal. It didn't issue that.
Haley, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're actually having some difficulty with your audio now because this is the Zoom world. I'm going to ask you just to mute and unmute and see if that fixes the problem.
You might be stuck with me.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. It's just not particularly clear, and I want people to be able to hear what you're saying. It's unfortunately just a little warbled, a little mumbled, but we will try. And if not, I'm going to ask you to just come back in if you can.
So when years ago. No question that I would do so without any agreement in place. He is now left us and Israel in a place where with this nuclear development. The absence of any deal and our isolation on this issue for a world stage.
Haley, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We can't hear you. I'm just going to ask you to come back in. It's a chain of events. So just leave and come back into your link, and we'll hear from you. It's okay, Congressman Wexler, because I have actually an individual question for you as well, and also for Congressman Deutsch, but we're dropping like flies. It's okay. Hopefully everybody comes back. I can ask you kind of to follow up on that same question. You know, we're assuming that the Iranians will come back to the negotiating table, that everything will be hunky-dory, but many still have the original concerns about what was in or what was not in the deal, some of which you referenced. How do you correct for that? And do you think realistically that's going to be possible?
Well, just as a predicate, nothing is hunky-dory with Iran, and we shouldn't assume that they would behave either rationally or in an appropriate fashion in any manner. And Vice President Biden knows this as well as anyone. So I think what we would foresee for a Biden administration is a very realistic, fully eyes open approach in terms of confronting Iran at all levels, nuclear, conventional, in the various areas throughout the Middle East and Iran's nefarious behavior, and in South America, by the way, they gain a foothold. And the way to do it is to have a principled opposition to their nuclear program. And this time, rather than last time, in my humble opinion, include in their non-nuclear behavior in terms of the negotiations. I think the issue that most people took concern about in the original Iran agreement was the time frame. And I think lessons have been learned where a limited time frame is not sufficient. And I would have great confidence that the next time the opportunity presents itself, that a Biden administration will insist that that time frame be extended out. But the critical part of the program, let us not forget, was that Iran eliminated 97%, effectively its entire nuclear capacity, in a verifiable way. And the world was unified in terms of eliminating the possibility of its plutonium and uranium development. That is a success. The fact that President Trump chose to pull America out from that agreement and now ironically seeks to implement the sanction aspects of the agreement so as to create additional pressure on Iran, the very sanctions that President Obama and Vice President Biden negotiated, is somewhat ironic. Unfortunately, even our closest allies are not buying that position. I wish they did. I wish the British and the French and the Germans were with us, but the Trump administration has failed to persuade even our closest allies that that is the best way to prevent Iran's nefarious behavior.
Thank you, Congressman. Haley, welcome back. I'm going to allow you to continue what you were saying, perhaps restart to make sure we get it all.
Great. How is the audio now?
Great.
You can hear me? Okay, great. Well, just building on what Congressman Wexler said, I worked for the ambassador to the United Nations. I saw many votes at the Security Council, including some that were led by the United States. I have never seen us lose a vote, let alone with only one other supporter. And this failure last week of the Trump administration at the UN Security Council was embarrassing. It was shameful, and it was related to Iran. This was an effort to renew the arms embargo against Iran. It should have passed, but it demonstrated the complete isolation of the United States under this administration. And importantly, that is something that a Biden administration would reverse, because right now it's us that's isolated, not Iran. And Iran is moving forward with its nuclear nuclear development, because when Donald Trump walked away from this Iran deal, he did so in isolation. He did so with nothing to replace it. And we are not better off today, nor is Israel, with nothing in place to ensure Iran does not move forward with its nuclear development. And we can't get back there in isolation. We can't go back to an agreement. As imperfect as that agreement may have been, and Congressman Wexler talked about how we could improve that agreement in a Biden administration, we need to rely on our allies. We need to look to the rest of the world to be with us. And we can't do that on our own or with one other country with us, in this case, the Dominican Republic. So that vote was a really good example of the fact that when we are isolated, we can't support our allies like Israel. And that is the legacy of this administration. The Trump administration has isolated the United States, and a Biden administration would reverse that.
Thank you both. I want to ask two brief questions, then we'll open up to audience Q&A. We discussed the platform committee earlier, and obviously, there were stories, reportings of compromises that were made, and behind the scenes work to make sure that, or perhaps Joe Biden writing the platform himself, that the language would reflect the Biden administration's position on Israel and other things. But obviously, there is a concern that in trying to perhaps bring elements of the party together, and from the more progressive voices, and that might be Bernie Sanders or others, that they will still, they obviously might have different thinking on foreign policy, whether it's Israel or other issues, and they'll want to try to find a way to exert their thinking on the Biden administration. Do either of you anticipate that happening? And is that something that particularly pro-Israel supporters should be concerned about?
If I may, I respect the questions and I respect the concerns. They're fair to raise. But in the case of Vice President Biden, this isn't someone who just got elected to Congress yesterday or didn't have 8 years as a vice president. And even if 4 decades of solidly straight line pro-Israel activity wasn't sufficient for you, his most important pick in terms of what he's doing now is his vice presidential nominee, and Senator Harris clearly stands in the Biden wing of the Democratic Party in terms of Israel. So I don't know what more Vice President Biden could possibly do to engender the type of confidence that he has built up over 4 decades of being one of Israel's strongest, staunchest supporter, day in, day out, in every circumstance. I remember very clearly when Vice President Biden landed in Israel, and the Israeli government had announced some settlement building that was viewed as being somewhat disrespectful, possibly, to the United States. And there were voices then that Vice President Biden should get on the plane and just turn around. And Vice President Biden stayed, and he met with his friend, long-term relationship Prime Minister Netanyahu, and they talked things through. Diplomacy in action. Vice President Biden has 4+ decades of that kind of record. His pick for vice president is exactly like him in terms of staunchly supportive of Israel. I wish we could say that President Trump's record regarding Israel and his activities to the American Jewish community were so solidly, consistently supportive of Israel and the interests of the American Jewish community over that period of time.
Haley, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I mean, I would say we can't say that. When it comes down to it, President Trump has actually not been a great ally to Israel. I think if you look at this UAE agreement, of course, we welcome peace between Israel and its neighbors, but let's look at it with another aspect of it, and that is annexation. And this provided Netanyahu an off-ramp
for a very bad policy that President Trump actually put forward in his so-called peace plan earlier this year. Now, obviously, the Israelis didn't want to move forward with annexation. Now that it looks like they were looking for an opportunity for a reprieve, to walk away from these announcements of annexation, because it was not in Israel's interest. When it comes to support of Israel, there's no question that Donald Trump has politicized it. And with Biden, we would see an increase in that bipartisan aspect of this relationship. But also as it relates to regional security threats, Donald Trump, by walking away from withdrawing U.S. troops from Syria, has left a vacuum on Israel's northern border that Iran and its proxies have filled by walking away from the Iran nuclear agreement with nothing to replace it. Now, Iran is moving forward with its nuclear development. So, we are now, as we've said, isolated in the world. That's not in our interest. That's not in Israel's interest. And Biden and Harris would work to repair those relationships and would strengthen this relationship and also our security interests in the region. So I think that it's important to point out that their experience, and Robert mentioned 4 decades, we've actually never had a nominee on any side of the aisle for president who has a longer and stronger record on Israel than Joe Biden. He was elected in 1972 to the Senate and has been working on these issues with 9 Israeli prime ministers ever since. So, there is no one with a stronger record on Israel's run for president than Joe Biden. And I think we can all rest assured that as president, he would only strengthen this relationship.
Belle, if I may.
Sure.
If I learned one thing during my 13 years that I was privileged to be in Congress, it was that when a power vacuum is created, for whatever reason, when America withdraws, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's the Pacific, wherever it is, that power vacuum, much more likely than not, is going to be filled by actors who do not represent policies that are consistent with America's. And almost always, in terms of Israel, Israel is less secure after that power vacuum is created rather than being more secure. And if anyone thought that that wasn't the case in the context of Iran, this weekend, they should evaluate what happened at the United Nations. This, unfortunately, was a loss for America. It was a tremendous loss for Israel. And that ought to guide people in terms of, forget Trump or Biden, but what's the best policy for America and Israel long term? And it can't possibly be that a one-sided American approach without the help and assistance of our allies, that will not create the sanction program that we need relative to Iran to stop them from becoming a nuclear behavior and stop them from their nefarious behavior in Syria and unfortunately Lebanon and several other venues.
Thank you both so much for those comprehensive questions. I wanted to ask one about Florida, but we'll save that for when Congressman Deutsch comes back, hopefully. I'll obviously just say you both know very well that we at AJC don't think things are so simple in terms of President Trump's record on Israel, but obviously, should the Biden administration take office, we hope and support, everything that you said, that those things would come to fruition. So we will see what happens, and obviously it's DNC week, so we expect nothing less than exactly what you said. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Daniel for audience Q&A.
Thank you, Belle. And we're still working behind the scenes to try and get Ted back in, who has experienced some technical difficulties. So sorry about that. Our first question comes from Vera Stanley in Dallas, and this is for you, Congressman Wexler. Longtime AJC friend, Representative Nita Lowey, recently had a legislative win in the House with the passage of the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, which AJC supported. The act will fund people-to-people Israeli-Palestinian peace-building projects. The legislation was bipartisan and was praised by organizations across the Israel advocacy spectrum. Should Congress be doing more of this? And do you envision that a Biden administration will encourage this?
The simple answer is yes. It's a terrific program, $250 million over 5 years to encourage assistance programs, people-to-people programs. This is the baseline of on-the-ground diplomacy, but it should represent only the beginning. It's not a substitute for a diplomatic initiative by the United States, not to try to create some comprehensive peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians overnight, but to create conditions where lives are improved for Israelis and Palestinians, take steps to improve people's lives, and also at the same time to narrow the political differences between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And if an American administration were to first commit itself, recommit our policy to a negotiated two-state solution, 2 states for 2 peoples, and you know, I think a good example is President Trump, of course, moved our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, something I personally support. But the question is, how can we gain the remainder of the world in recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital? How can we bring in other countries to do the same thing? The way to do that is through a diplomatic initiatives where the rest of the world perceives American policy as not only being supportive of Israel, as we must and should, deservingly so, but also recognizing the self-determination rights of the Palestinian people. So that's the kind of, I wouldn't call it balance, that's the kind of successful policy where we encourage the Israelis to move certain areas from Area C in the West Bank, which is complete Israeli control, to B or A, so that the Palestinians have a degree of self-governance, and then create more opportunities for Palestinians in terms of economics and family reunification and a whole host of programs, all that are consistent with what Representative Nita Lowey accomplished, hopefully will continue to accomplish with this Fund for Peace, in effect. And congratulations to the AJC for supporting it so wholeheartedly.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Daniel, I believe we have Congressman Deutsch back. Are you there, Congressman?
I tried getting on my phone. I hope this has worked.
We hear you loud and clear. Before taking our next question,
Fantastic.
I did want to give you an opportunity to finish what you were saying earlier. So if you'd like to continue.
Sure. I've been trying to follow along as best I can, and I think Robert and Haley both addressed this, but just really quickly, the only point I was making was that that we have an incredibly talented group of new members, no longer new, but certainly in their first term, members of the Democratic caucus in the House. And in a Biden administration, under a pro-Israel platform and a Biden administration that is committed to strengthening the U.S. Israel relationship and enhancing American diplomacy around the world in ways that will only benefit not only the United States, but our allies, especially Israel, those members will have an even greater opportunity to help lead in and usher in this new generation of wonderful pro-Israel leadership in the House. And I don't think we spend enough time, frankly, focusing on those good members. And if we're looking ahead, that's one thing that we have to look forward to that I think is critical and certainly should make us all feel really optimistic about what things will look like going forward.
Thank you, Congressman. A very important point. And Daniel, I'm going to turn it back to you to continue with Q&A.
Thank you, Bill. This question comes from Roy Stern in Potomac, Maryland. Congressman Deutsch and Wexler, you both mentioned that the success of the UAE-Israel peace deal should be celebrated across the political spectrum. Are there other Republican Middle East initiatives that should be supported in a potential Biden administration? Are there certain initiatives or policies that should be reversed? Congressman Wexler, start with you.
Maybe if Ted can hear, he hasn't had a chance to talk as much.
I can, and thanks, Robert. And I appreciate the question a lot because it gives me an opportunity to remind everyone on this call that the strength of the U.S.-Israel relationship has been premised upon the bipartisan nature of the U.S.-Israel relationship, and so everything that we've discussed, whether it's the U.S. Israel Strategic Partnership Act, a bill that I co-authored with Ileana Ross-Lehtinen, or the follow-up to it that we moved forward on in this Congress with my friend, the ranking member Joe Wilson. These are bipartisan efforts, and rather than look for things and characterize them as Democratic bills or Republican bills, an organization like AJC especially understands how important it is for us to work together and to push back so exceedingly hard against anyone in either party who tries to use the U.S. Israel relationship for political gain at the expense of, I would argue, the United States and Israel and the relationship that we have together.
And if I may just add quickly, the fallacy, unfortunately, of President Trump's approach of removing America from agreements that had international consensus, whether it be the nuclear agreement with Iran, or quite frankly, early on in the Trump administration, removing us from the Pacific Partnership, the trade pact. It is now established that having done that type of American removal, that China, for instance, in the Pacific has become more powerful, not less powerful. And we've given up less of our economic tools by removing ourselves from that agreement. And the same is happening with Iran now. And that, I think, is the example to demonstrate for the next administration, the Biden administration, that, clear-eyed diplomacy, not naive diplomacy, learn some of the lessons from the past, no doubt, make the Iran agreement and the standards improved. But that type of diplomatic initiative is better off in terms of both the United States and Israel, the result of what we see in terms of go it alone approach under President Trump.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Rebecca DeSoto in Tampa, Florida. Haley, there have been a lot of rumors about the importance of Israel on the outcome of the U.S. election. While we would all agree that Israel is a critical ally of the United States, how important is the issue to your average U.S. voter?
Well, it's a great question. And, the answer is as follows. For Jewish voters, we know a few things. We know that an overwhelming majority, over 90%, consider themselves to be pro-Israel. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that they approve or agree with every policy of the Israeli government. About 59% of that 90% actually are critical of at least some of the current Israeli government's policies, which is similar to how we view our own government, right? We are proud American patriots, but we disagree with some aspects, and in this case, I personally disagree with many aspects of our current administration's policies. So there's that aspect of it. But then when we look at prioritization of issues and what issues are driving the Jewish vote in this critically important election, we know that the majority of the top issues driving this vote, not unlike the American electorate, are domestic policy issues, starting with access to affordable health care. Currently, we face an unprecedented pandemic. 169,000 Americans have lost their lives. This has affected all of us. And this is what is driving the vote in this election, our own health and access to health care, in addition to the economic situation, in addition to our own security. And when it comes to our security, this is new for the Jewish electorate, that we are now voting increasingly on our insecurity. The reason that we have to walk through metal detectors to enter our synagogues is because of the rise of white nationalists nationalism that has targeted our community and is no question been emboldened by Donald Trump. So these domestic policy issues, our own security, our health, our economic situation, and our own security when it comes to this epidemic of gun violence that has impacted all of our communities, but especially when you look at the Parkland shooting a year ago, Congressman Deutsch's district. These are the issues that are driving the Jewish vote, and all of those issues, they're the reason that an overwhelming majority of Jewish voters support Democrats, because Democrats align with the Jewish community on all of these issues, including Israel. So I think that, you know, the Jewish vote itself is not unlike the American electorate writ large. It's domestic policy issues that are driving the vote.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Phyllis Lefkowitz in St. Louis, and this is for Congressman Deutsch. As support for Israel is perceived by some as increasingly partisan, can you share ways in which you plan or you currently work with colleagues across the aisle on this issue?
We work together on this issue on a regular basis, and I mean I would point to the successes that we had just in this past Congress on the resolution that we passed that reaffirmed our commitment to a two-state solution at the same time that we reaffirmed our support for our ironclad support for Israel's security. You see it in the legislation that builds upon the U.S. Israel Strategic Partnership Act, and it does two things. It looks for ways to expand the relationship in greater ways in agriculture and humanitarian relief and cyber, and also takes the memorandum of understanding that was struck between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu and puts it into statute for the first time. That passed the House of Representatives unanimously. So we work together again, and I can't say this any more strongly. We work together on a regular basis. We've spent a lot of time on this call, understandably talking about the security issues that Israel faces, and focusing as we have often about the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. When you take a step back and you recognize that the relationship between the United States and Israel is founded upon, and Robert and Haley have both talked about this, founded upon the shared values of the U.S. and Israel, then you recognize that these debates, when we see these play out in what's happening here, the debates that we're having in our country, the efforts to strengthen our country and address the needs of people who are suffering, to focus on making sure that we have a fully inclusive country that addresses the challenges of the racial disparities that we've seen. These same efforts to make our country stronger, we see in Israel, whether it's protests, whether it's the active debate that takes place in the Knesset. That's exactly what brings our countries together. It's why we have legislation with over 200 co-sponsors bipartisan right now to expand health cooperation over COVID, given the ways that Israel has had to grapple with these issues together with the United States. So it's important that we recognize the ways we work together. It's also important to recognize that both countries have the same values of trying to build up a stronger and more united country. And that's really, as Haley talked about, that's really what we're focusing on, because after all, the U.S. Israel relationship is in its best position when America is strong and leads both here at home and globally. And that's why this election is so important. And that's why so many of us are so excited about the Democratic Convention and the Biden-Harris ticket.
Thank you so much, Congressman Deutsch. We always like to end on an uplifting note, and I think it's important for our viewers to understand that even though we're talking about one party right now and having this somewhat partisan conversation, that there are people committed to the bipartisan nature of the U.S.-Israel relationship, and obviously the shared values piece of this is so important, and we at AJC fully support that. I want to thank our three distinguished panelists for your candor, for your thoughts, for your friendship with AJC, and also for bearing with us through our technical difficulties in this virtual world. And also to our audience, I saw we had a very large audience throughout the conversation, so thank you all. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel to close us out.
Thank you all for that fascinating conversation. Congressman Wexler, Haley, and Congressman Deutsch, we truly appreciate you taking the time to be with us, especially during such a busy week. For those of you who would like to register for upcoming AJC at the Conventions programming, please visit www.ajc.org/conventions. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.